Throughout the centuries in history, there have been a huge number of execution methods which were used to take the life of a condemned person or a criminal. One of the most brutal execution methods is remembered alongside King Henry VIII, hanging, drawing and quartering, in which many people who were convicted of treason were subjected to this. But Henry VIII would deploy many other methods to execute his enemies, and there was one time he would even change the laws of his country so he could introduce an execution method which was truly sadistic. There were many times in different lands where execution methods struck fear into the hearts of the population. For example, in France, people were pulled apart by horses for committing acts of regicide, and in ancient Rome, people were forced to fight against animals such as tigers and lions. But Henry VIII's laws would incorporate boiling alive, an execution method which would cause chaos with the people who witnessed it, and many were struck by the savagery of this. Join us today as we look at boiling alive, history's most brutal execution method, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Boiling alive was an execution method in which a person who was condemned would be killed by being immersed and submerged in boiling water or other liquid. It was in England an execution method which was not as common as hanging, drawing and quartering, burning at the stake or beheading. But it was used in many different lands and countries, and the executioner could control the execution ordeal and prolong it for someone who was a particularly heinous criminal. They could control the speed of the execution, and sometimes people were pulled out of the boiling liquid when they were just alive. They would then be lowered into the pot again a number of times, and this would make things and their suffering a lot worse. Executioners would, instead of water, often fill the boiling pot up with oil or tar, and a pulley and hook system could be used to dunk someone in and out of the vessel, and this would have been horrific and terrifying for someone to have seen. There were many people who were executed by being boiled to death in Scotland. John Haroldson, who was known as the Blood Earl of Orkney, would order the execution method and boiling of the Bishop of Caithness, Adam of Melrose, and a monk who was named Serlo. The bishop had attempted to try and collect increased taxes, and he raised the price, and it was said that, "The devil take the bishop and his butter, you may roast him if you please." But on the 11th of September 1222, a group of men and rebels gathered to protest the bishop, screaming, "Roast him alive," and the bishop's monk Serlo was dispatched to go and deal with this. But the monk was slaughtered, and then the bishop was dragged into his kitchen in his house, and he was forced into a cauldron, where he was burned alive, and he was then boiled alive after permission had been given to do this. But in reprisal for the killing of the bishop, King Alexander III killed 400 people for this. But William de Soules was a nobleman who had plotted against Robert the Bruce, and he was said to have been a sorcerer or a witch who worked with evil spirits, and he too was boiled alive in 1321. More boilings happened as Melville, the sheriff of the Mearns, and the laird of Glenberville were boiled, as they were hated for their rules and laws that they imposed upon the Scottish people. It was even said that the people would make a broth out of these two hated figures, and that the nobles then tasted a spoon of the broth from the boiling alive. But boiling was used in other lands as a way of punishing people who were known as coin clippers or counterfeiters and forgers. These executions were carried out in front of huge crowds to put people off committing these crimes, which could be incredibly damaging to the economy of a country. In 1392 in Nuremberg in Germany, a man was boiled alive for murdering his own mother, and then 60 years later in Danzig, a number of coin clippers were boiled, and then this continued. In Bremen in 1687, a man was boiled alive in oil, and he was found guilty of helping coin clippers escape their fate, and some towns still display their boiling pots as historic artefacts. Inside of the Holy Roman Empire, boiling to death in oil was used for the murderers, whose crimes were particularly shocking and awful. But in Asia it was also deployed, as in the 1500s, the legendary bandit from Japan, Ishikawa Goemon, and his son suffered the execution method, and in the 17th century it was used in India. A Sikh martyr in 1675 was boiled to death in Delhi for religious reasons, as he had refused to convert to Islam, and he was first put in a cauldron of freezing cold water, but then this was slowly heated up to the point of boiling, and he was then roasted and cooked alive. It was said by a witness that he was tied to the cauldron with an iron chain, and he could not escape, and the water came up to his midriff, so people could see his head and shoulders, but then he turned into a block of charcoal. However, the most famous time in which someone would be boiled alive took place during the reign of King Henry VIII, as the Tudor monarch, who had 6 wives, would execute Richard Roose, a cook, in this way. Over 70,000 people in his kingdom were executed during his reign. This would include 2 of his own wives. But in February 1531, there was a shocking incident in the household of Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher, as a poisoning plot would hit London. John Fisher was a devout Catholic, and the cook, Richard Roose, had poisoned the porridge. But this was a plot to assassinate Fisher, and many believe that it was the king or Anne Boleyn and her family who could have been behind this. But with the incident, 2 people died who had been claiming charity from the bishop. But the incident caused chaos with the reputations, as he was a supporter of the king's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and the fact he hated the changes Henry VIII was making to the church meant that Fisher could have very easily incurred the wrath of the king. But the man allegedly behind this was Richard Roose, Fisher's cook, and Henry VIII, to punish Roose, would change the laws on treason. Roose was imprisoned inside of the Tower of London, and he would then be tortured using the rack, and he admitted to putting a laxative in the porridge, but he admitted that he did not want to kill anyone, and said this was just a joke. Henry VIII changed his laws to make boiling alive a method of execution for those who were found guilty of poisoning. This was done because of Richard Roose, and the method was brought in to send a clear message to the people of England not to poison, as the king himself was terrified of it. Richard Roose was then taken to Smithfield, where many people were burned at the stake, on the 15th of April 1532. His execution was performed over 2 long and gruelling hours, and he would be lowered in and out of the boiling cauldron a number of times. One account said that he was lowered in and out of the boiling water 3 times, until he was dead, but another said of the execution, "He roared mighty loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead, and other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work." His execution lived in the minds of many people, and it was so barbaric that people threw up and were sick at the sight of it. But boiling alive would be used again for a woman who was called Margaret Davy, who would use poison to murder, but then it was outlawed by Edward VI's new government. But it was claimed it may have been used in modern times in countries such as Peru and also in Uzbekistan. But boiling alive was one of the most horrific execution methods used throughout the centuries. The people who would see these executions would be horrifically scarred by what they saw, and it was the execution method which was comparable with burning alive at the stake. The kings and queens who used boiling alive would be known for being some of history's most brutal rulers. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.